Watch a narcissist in a room full of people for long enough, and you'll notice something strange. They can charm almost everyone. The room laughs at their jokes. Strangers walk away saying how magnetic they were, how confident, how easy to talk to. And then, somewhere in that same room, there's one person who didn't fall for it, didn't applaud quite as hard, didn't lean in the way everyone else did. And the narcissist noticed that person before they noticed almost anyone else, because that person did something different, something most people don't even realize they're doing, and it is the single most disarming thing a narcissist will ever encounter. Authentic people don't perform back. That's the whole secret, and it's so simple it almost sounds anticlimactic until you understand exactly what it disrupts. Because a narcissist's entire social operating system is built on a very specific transaction. They perform, and the room reflects that performance back, amplified in the form of laughter, admiration, agreement, attention. This transaction is so automatic, so deeply practiced, that most people participate in it without ever noticing they're participating in anything at all. You laugh because the joke was genuinely funny, or because the room is laughing, or because not laughing feels awkward. You agree because disagreeing in a group setting takes more energy than going along. You mirror their energy because mirroring is what humans do instinctively in social situations. Matching tone, matching enthusiasm, matching the emotional temperature of whoever's speaking. Authentic people, without necessarily trying to break this mirror, not through hostility, not through visible skepticism, not through anything a narcissist could easily identify and target. They break it simply by responding to what's actually happening instead of what's being performed. If the joke is genuinely funny, they laugh. If it isn't, they don't, regardless of who told it or how confidently it was delivered. If they agree with a point, they say so. If they don't, they say that too, calmly, without the anxious over-explanation most people add to soften a disagreement into something more palatable. This sounds like an unremarkable way to move through the world. To a narcissist, it registers as something closer to defiance, not because the authentic person intended it that way, but because a narcissist's entire sense of social power depends on everyone in the room responding to the performance rather than the substance underneath it. Here's the first thing authentic people do differently, and it's the foundation everything else builds on. They evaluate the message, not the delivery. Most people, without realizing it, get swept up in confidence itself. The smooth, unhesitating way a narcissist tells a story, makes a claim, presents themselves as the obvious authority in any given room. Confidence reads, to most nervous systems, as a proxy for competence and honesty, even though the two have almost nothing to do with each other. An authentic person has, usually through hard experience, learned to separate those two things. They'll notice the confidence, register it as a data point, and then ask a much more useful internal question. Does what's actually being said hold up on its own, independent of how convincingly it was delivered? This single habit, separating style from substance, is one of the most effective, least visible forms of protection that exists against narcissistic manipulation, because it removes the primary tool a narcissist relies on to bypass critical thinking altogether. The second thing authentic people do differently is refuse to compete for the narcissist's approval, even when the social pressure to do so is intense. This is subtler than it sounds, because the pressure to seek a narcissist's approval rarely announces itself directly. It shows up as a kind of ambient current running through any room they occupy, a sense that their attention is valuable, scarce, worth angling for, that being noticed or complimented by them carries a specific kind of social currency other people's attention doesn't quite match. Most people, without consciously deciding to, orient slightly toward that current. They laugh a little harder at the narcissist's jokes specifically. They direct a little more of the conversation toward topics the narcissist seems interested in. An authentic person simply doesn't do this recalibration. Their attention and warmth remain roughly consistent regardless of who's in the room, which means the narcissist doesn't get the specific elevated response their presence usually generates. And that absence is registered almost immediately as strange, noticeable, sometimes even threatening. This is worth pausing on because it explains something that puzzles a lot of people the first time they watch it happen. Why narcissists so often become fixated in a strange, almost magnetic way on the one person in a room who seems the least impressed by them. It isn't romantic interest necessarily, and it isn't always hostility either. It's closer to an unconscious compulsion to close the gap, to figure out what it would take to get the elevated reaction from this particular person that they get from almost everyone else, because the absence of that reaction feels, to a narcissist's fragile, externally regulated sense of self, like an unsolved problem demanding a solution. Authentic people often become targets of intense, sudden charm offensives specifically because they didn't respond the way everyone else did. And understanding this dynamic in advance is one of the most useful things an empath can know because it reframes sudden, intense narcissistic interest not as flattering but as a kind of alarm bell worth taking seriously. The third thing authentic people do differently is tolerate silence and disagreement without rushing to fill or fix it. This might be the hardest one to build if it doesn't come naturally to you, because so many of us, especially empaths, are trained from an early age to treat any tension in a room as an emergency requiring immediate resolution. A narcissist, whether consciously or not, often uses conversational pressure as a tool, pausing expectantly after a claim, waiting for validation, subtly escalating a disagreement until the other person backs down just to restore comfort. Authentic people are notably resistant to this pressure. They can sit inside a disagreement or a silence without their nervous system screaming at them to fix it immediately. This isn't coldness, it's simply the absence of the specific anxiety that makes most people cave under social pressure they haven't consciously registered as pressure at all. And here's the piece that ties all three of these together, the thing underneath the behavior rather than the behavior itself. Authentic people aren't doing any of this as a deliberate strategy against narcissists. That's actually the most important detail in this entire story, and it's the one that makes their resistance so much more effective than any calculated technique could ever be. They're not performing detachment, not consciously withholding validation as a power move, not running some internal script designed to disarm manipulation. They're simply, genuinely being themselves, responding honestly, valuing substance over performance, tolerating discomfort without needing to immediately resolve it, because that's who they actually are underneath any specific social situation, narcissist or otherwise. And it's precisely because none of it is a performance that a narcissist can't find the seam to exploit. This is exactly why narcissists find authentic people so much harder to manipulate than almost anyone else. And it's worth understanding the mechanics of why, because the answer isn't what most people assume. It isn't that authentic people are smarter, more emotionally guarded, or naturally suspicious of others. Many of them are, if anything, more open than most. What actually protects them is something structural rather than defensive. They don't have a gap between their inner experience and their outer presentation for a narcissist to work with. Manipulation, at its core, requires a target audience willing to accept a curated version of reality over their own direct perception of it. It works by exploiting the space most people leave between what they actually think and feel and what they're willing to say or show. A person with a large gap, someone who smiles when they're uncomfortable, agrees when they're unconvinced, laughs when something isn't actually funny, gives a manipulator an enormous amount of room to operate because there's a whole layer of performed response sitting between their real reaction and what gets communicated to the world. That gap is exactly where gaslighting lives. exactly where love bombing gains traction, exactly where a narcissist can convince someone their own perception is unreliable because the person has spent so long presenting something other than their actual internal state that they've lost some of their own fluency in reading it accurately. Authentic people have almost no gap. What they feel and what they express are nearly the same thing, moving together in real time. This doesn't mean they say every thought that crosses their mind without filter. Authenticity isn't the same as bluntness, and most genuinely authentic people are quite skilled, even gentle, in how they communicate difficult truths. What it means is that their internal compass and their outer behavior are calibrated to the same signal. When something feels wrong, it shows, even subtly. When something feels right, that shows too. There's no elaborate performance layer for a narcissist to study, learn, and eventually exploit, because the authentic person isn't running two separate operating systems, one for what they actually think and another for what they're willing to display. This becomes especially clear in how authentic people handle being love-bombed, which is worth examining specifically because it's one of the primary tools narcissists rely on, and one of the few tactics that consistently underperforms against this particular type of person. Love bombing works by creating an overwhelming sense of being uniquely, specially seen, a flood of attention and validation calibrated to bond someone quickly before their judgment has time to catch up to the intensity of the feeling. It works exceptionally well on people whose sense of worth is externally sourced, because the flood of validation fills a need that's already actively seeking to be filled. Authentic people, by contrast, tend to have a much more stable, internally generated sense of their own worth, not because they're more special or more evolved, but often because they've done real work, sometimes painful work, to build a foundation that doesn't require external confirmation to feel solid. Which means when the flood of attention arrives, it registers as pleasant, maybe even flattering, but it doesn't land in the specific, hungry place love bombing is designed to target. There's no vacancy for it to fill. This is also why authentic people tend to notice the speed of a narcissist's approach far earlier than most people do, because they're not swept up in the emotional intensity the way someone with an unfilled need for validation might be. They retain enough clarity to notice the pacing itself as information. This is moving remarkably fast. This person barely knows me and is already calling me their soulmate, their perfect match, the only person who's ever really understood them. Where someone caught up in the flood might interpret that speed as evidence of a rare, powerful connection, an authentic person is far more likely to interpret it correctly as a red flag, not because they're cynical about love, but because their internal compass is calibrated enough to register that genuine intimacy, the real kind, almost never actually moves this fast. There's a final piece to how authentic people navigate this, and it's perhaps the most important, because it explains what happens after the initial charm offensive fails to land the way the narcissist expects. Most people, once they start noticing inconsistencies in a narcissist's behavior, go through an extended period of self-doubt before trusting what they're seeing, second-guessing their own perception, giving the benefit of the doubt far longer than the evidence actually warrants, because they've been conditioned by this relationship or others to distrust their own read of a situation in favor of an external explanation. Authentic people tend to move through this phase much faster, not because they're immune to self-doubt entirely, but because they built a habit of checking their perception against their own direct experience first, rather than immediately deferring to whatever explanation the other person is offering. When something doesn't add up, they don't need the narcissist's permission to believe it doesn't add up. The inconsistency itself is enough information. This is precisely why narcissists so often lose interest in authentic people relatively quickly, in a way that can feel from the outside almost like relief, but is actually its own kind of instructive pattern. The charm offensive gets deployed, doesn't produce the expected result, and rather than escalating indefinitely the way a narcissist might with someone more susceptible, they simply redirect their energy towards someone whose reactions offer a better return. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't because the authentic person did something clever to repel them. It's because a narcissist's entire strategy depends on efficiency, finding sources of supply that respond predictably to the usual tools, and an authentic person without any deliberate effort simply isn't an efficient source. The tools don't work the way they're supposed to, and a narcissist, whatever else you might say about them, is usually quick to notice when an investment isn't paying off. Authentic people fall in love too. They can be genuinely moved by real moments of connection, including the rare, unguarded moments a narcissist is capable of offering before the pattern fully reveals itself. What protects them isn't invulnerability, it's speed of recovery and clarity once the pattern becomes visible. And that difference matters enormously, because it's the difference between someone who might get hurt once and leave and someone who stays inside a cycle of harm for years, unable to fully trust what they're seeing, even after the evidence has accumulated far past the point of reasonable doubt. This is worth naming plainly, because it's the most useful, most actionable piece of everything we've discussed. The qualities that make someone authentic aren't fixed traits you either have or don't have from birth. They're built slowly, usually through the same kind of deliberate practice that builds any other form of internal strength. If you've recognized throughout this story that you tend to perform back, laughing harder than you feel, agreeing faster than you actually agree, softening your real reactions to keep a room comfortable, that isn't a permanent character flaw. It's a habit formed for understandable reasons, usually somewhere along the way when authenticity itself started to feel unsafe or unwelcome. And habits formed under one set of conditions can be unlearned under a different set, deliberately, with practice that will feel uncomfortable and unnatural at first, the way any real change tends to. The starting point is almost always the same, and it's smaller than people expect, noticing the gap in real time. The next time you feel the urge to laugh at something that wasn't actually funny, to agree with something you don't actually believe, to smooth over a reaction that doesn't match what you're genuinely feeling, pause just for a second and notice that the gap exists. You don't have to close it immediately. You don't have to blurt out an unfiltered disagreement in a room where that would be genuinely costly. The goal, at first, isn't perfect authenticity in every interaction. It's simply awareness, building the habit of noticing your own performance as it's happening. Because awareness is the prerequisite for eventually closing the gap on purpose, in the moments where it actually matters. Over time, this practice compounds into something remarkable, and it's the same thing that makes authentic people so uniquely resistant to narcissistic manipulation in the first place. An internal compass that responds to what's real instead of what's expected. This is what actually protects you, not vigilance, not suspicion, not a defensive posture you have to consciously maintain in every social interaction. Just the accumulated result of consistently trusting your own direct experience over an external performance, practiced so many times it eventually stops requiring conscious effort at all. If you're someone who has spent years performing back, smoothing your reactions, softening your disagreements, laughing at jokes that didn't land, agreeing with things that never sat right, I want you to understand something important about why that pattern developed in the first place, because it almost certainly wasn't weakness. It was very likely adaptation. Somewhere along the way, in some relationship or environment, authenticity carried a cost that felt too high to pay. Disagreement led to conflict you couldn't afford. Genuine reactions were met with punishment, dismissal, or the specific kind of narcissistic cruelty that targets exactly the parts of you that dared to be real. Performing back was, in that context, protective. It kept you safe when safety wasn't guaranteed any other way. But the environment that made that adaptation necessary isn't the only environment you'll ever exist in, and the habit that once protected you can, over time, become the exact vulnerability a new narcissist learns to exploit. This is the deeper reason authenticity matters so much in this specific context. Not because it's a moral virtue you're failing to live up to, but because it's genuinely, structurally protective in a way almost nothing else is. A narcissist can study your words. They can study your body language, your patterns, your triggers, if you give them enough performed material to study. What they cannot study, cannot predict, and cannot manipulate is a reaction that's simply consistently true, because true reactions don't follow a script that can be learned and eventually exploited. They just are what they are every time, regardless of who's in the room. This is what authentic people do differently around narcissists, and it was never actually about narcissists specifically. It's about a way of being in the world that happens to be uniquely resistant to a particular kind of harm as a byproduct of something much larger. The simple, difficult, ongoing practice of letting your inside and your outside match, even when matching them costs you the easy comfort of going along with whatever's being performed around you. You don't have to become suspicious of everyone to protect yourself from this. You don't have to armor over the parts of you that feel deeply and trust easily, the parts that make you an empath in the first place. You simply have to keep practicing the smaller, quieter thing underneath all of it, noticing the gap, closing it a little more each time until responding honestly stops being an act of courage and simply becomes the way you move through every room you ever walk into. And once that happens, you won't need to spot a narcissist by their patterns anymore. You'll simply notice almost immediately that something in the room isn't real, because by then you'll have spent so long being real yourself that anything else will register instantly as exactly what it is. Thanks for watching.